Bring in Omar Baddar. He is a member of the National Policy Council of the Arab American Institute. Omar, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you joining us on the News Hour. The Israeli Prime Minister has indicated this may not be the last raid of this kind. Does the absence of any peace process create the conditions for something like this to happen?
Yeah, I don't think that there can be a peace process with the current Israeli government. I mean, the entire failure of the peace process that we've seen decades before is predicated on the fact that Israel was never interested in ending the occupation of the Palestinian territories. And there's been a systemic policy of expanding more and more settlements on Palestinian land. That's what killed any prospect for a peace process and a peace agreement moving forward. And this Israeli government is interested in essentially showing and shoring up public support by becoming harsher and harsher in its dealings with Palestinians. We have a reality of a brutal occupation in which Palestinians are denied their most basic human rights. And that naturally is going to trigger resistance to that occupation. No people anywhere on the planet would agree to live without rights indefinitely and under permanent military occupation and apartheid. And rather than look for ways to settle this issue, to try to come to a genuine peace agreement, this Israeli government is unfortunately looking only for escalation. So Netanyahu's comments are completely unsurprising, but obviously they will not lead to anything positive moving forward.
Sure, but there is an acceptance that, like Israel claim, armed groups are using the camp as a haven from which they can conduct attacks.
There is no question about the fact that there are armed groups, but we should be absolutely clear about the fact that Jenin is an occupied Palestinian land where Israel is carrying out an illegal occupation. So this is not Israeli territory. This is not territory that Israel has any right to operate in at all. I mean, we can imagine what it would be like if somebody tried to justify Russian operations in Ukraine saying we're finding militants and weapons. You just should not be there in the first place. And this is very similar in that the fundamental driving cause of this violence and the reason why there are militants in Jenin to begin with is because Israel is imposing this permanent occupation that every major human rights organization in the world at this point calls a system of apartheid, in which Israeli settlers are allowed to steal Palestinian land and live on it with full rights and full, participation in Israeli democracy, while Palestinians living next door live under military law and have absolutely no rights. That's an untenable situation. And the fact that Israel refuses to allow Palestinian meaningful independence and also refuses to give them equal rights puts us in a situation in which this violence is just bound to continue. And again, there is no military solution to the crisis that we're witnessing. If we are interested in long-term peace, that requires justice. And justice means that Israel has to recognize Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of all the rights that Israelis get to enjoy.
And how much of an issue is it that many of those young men within the camp would view the Palestinian Authority, who are supposed to have control over the camp, they view them as out of touch with absolutely no authority? In fact, they're absolutely discredited.
I think that is correct. The Palestinian Authority has relegated itself to complete irrelevance. Their entire approach has been one of security cooperation with Israel under the promise that Israel would then return the favor by withdrawing from the occupied territories and allowing for genuine Palestinian independence. And the problem is that we've seen the exact opposite on Israel's part. All we've seen is an entrenchment of the occupation, is more and more land theft and encroachment. And so the Palestinian Authority effectively at this point does nothing but provide basically administrative services to the Israeli occupation rather than resisting them meaningfully. I think which is part of the reason why we see this disillusionment with the Palestinian Authority and people throughout the occupied Palestinian territories, and particularly in Jenin, deciding to take matters into their own hands and picking up arms themselves because they don't see that there is any prospect for a political path forward, and seeing that the Palestinian Authority is not living up to its primary core responsibility of actually fighting for meaningful liberation and justice for Palestinians living there.
Yeah, sure. And ultimately, do you fear that this lack of authority within the camp, and indeed the raids that have taken place over the last few days, will ultimately play into the hands of the settlers who'll say, well, this is exactly why we should be living in this region?
Yeah, this is a chicken and egg situation. But again, it really comes down to the driving force. And you have, I think, the only country in the world that has meaningful leverage over Israel is the United States. And U.S. policy has been endlessly supplying Israel with military weapons to the tune of $4 billion a year that allows it to entrench this occupation. And whenever the U.S. has to comment on these situations, they constantly talk about the right of Israel to self-defense, even though Israel is the occupying and invading force here, and never uttering a word about Palestinian right to self-defense and self-determination. And that creates a dynamic in which we are inevitably going to witness this violence get out of hand. And then hardliners everywhere start using that as justification to basically behave even worse. There's only really one path forward in which anything productive can come. It is through justice, and justice does require that we recognize Palestinian rights. The fact that they've been denied under permanent military occupation for decades is absolutely insane. It is a situation in which nothing positive can possibly come until you deal with this underlying issue. No population living in the millions under decades of military occupation and military dictatorship would basically sustain this kind of status quo without things becoming violent. And that is, I think, where the responsibility of both the United States and the international community to come in and apply meaningful pressure on the Israeli government to change its behavior so that we can move in a more productive direction.
Okay, good to talk to you, Omar. I appreciate you coming on the program.